All right, Psalm 21, let's call this one Inheriting According to His Strength. And this psalm that once again might break down into three sections, even though they are not sections of equal length. The first and the last section are roughly the same, starting out with David simply saying, we rejoice in the Lord's strength. In the second section, he is saying that the Lord's right hand or his strength has the power to uncover or expose his enemies. And finally, in the last section, it is a single verse that goes back to the beginning, talking about the way in which the king and the Lord's people rejoice in his strength. Understanding that in verse 1, David starts out by saying, O Lord, in your strength, the king rejoices, as he seems to go on through about verse 7, talking about all of the ways in which God has shown him kindness, making it clear that David has a reason to say thanks to God. And therefore, even though as a younger man, Psalm 119 is going to say, before I was afflicted, I went astray, as with all of us. Life has a tendency to bring us into difficult times that can transform our modest appreciation into great rejoicing at the kindness that has been shown to us. In this chapter, David rejoicing for the kindness shown to him by God, as he moves into, as we said, the second section where he says in verse 8, your hand will find out all your enemies. Your right hand will find out those who hate you. And that reminded me of my time on the mission field. And one of the things I appreciated about the subtleties of the culture in which I worked can be wrapped up in a story I tell from time to time. And that is when you're going to see a chief or a big man, as the culture would call it. Sometimes you will walk into a room where somebody might have been already there doing some work, things you would associate with common labor or just basic service. In would walk an individual who looked pretty regal. And as you engaged with that individual who looked pretty chiefly, there were times when that person who was doing the servant work would greet you and introduce themselves as the actual chief. And so in this chapter that eventually says in verse 11, though they plan evil against you, though they devise mischief, they will not succeed. It is not limiting God's exposure of his enemies to people who have declared themselves enemies of God, understanding that we often quote one of the final parables or stories that Jesus told in his ministry in Matthew 25 about final judgment, about the sheep and the goats, the sheep being on his right hand, the goats being on his left, all seeming to have a single pass-fail final examination, meaning how did they treat him when they didn't know it was him, when God came to them in the form of those they might otherwise overlook, which reminded me that if Malawian culture, understanding that I was a missionary in Malawi for a number of years, had some pretty subtle and intricate ways of exposing what was really on the hearts of those who were coming to ask a petition or ask a favor of the chief, how much more is God able to expose what is actually on our hearts, regardless of the attitude that we outwardly project towards him, reminding me of a distinction that we mentioned in previous chapters, and that is the distinction between personality and character. Understanding that in this chapter, David is rejoicing in the ways in which God can use his power to show kindness to his people. He's also reminding us of the ways that God can use his power to expose an unhealthy distinction between our personality and our character. One of the things that David does not mention that might be just as important is in the same way that God has the ability to expose a distinction or an unhealthy distinction between our personality and our character, he likewise has the ability to reconcile an unhealthy distinction between our personality and our character to bring them into the kind of alignment that creates the kind of consistency which allows us to inherit not only a genuine internal peace, but a genuine peace with God.